These interviews are a part of the Oklahoma Historical Society's Oral History Program Living Legends collection. There is no original date given for this material. The interviews were conducted by Mr. Pendleton Woods. The interviewees are four gentlemen who were present at Pearl Harbor on the occasion of the Japanese bombing on December 7, 1941. Those gentlemen's names are Charles McKeen, Arthur Taylor, Veer S. McKennon, and Ray McPherson. They are military personnel. The location for this interview is unknown. This material is being re-recorded on the 9th of July, 1985 for inclusion in the permanent collections of the Oral History Program by Judith Michener.
This is Penn Woods. I'm interviewing for the Oklahoma Living Legends Library. I have with me four men who were at Pearl Harbor at the time of Pearl Harbor. We're talking with these people about what happened there, their own observations at this time. I'd like for you to give me your name and your address.
Charles H. McKeen. I live at 5100 Lombardy Lane. Capital MC, capital Kean.
You were in what unit in this time?
I was in the engineers force on the battleship USS Nevada.
Now you were in Pearl Harbor prior to and during the attack on Pearl Harbor. I wonder if starting possibly the morning of the 7th, if you could tell me what happened leading up to it, and then where you first got the wind of the fact that this was happening.
We were at, we had already had chow, which is food, and we were fixing to go to our work center at 8 o'clock, and the attack started approximately 7:55 in the morning. And I was hanging up my towel over my locker, fixing to go to my work center, and we heard the strafing along the side of the ship. 50 caliber ammunition from the strafing planes hit the ship, and this gentleman that was with me, Jesse James Jr., Crabtree was his name, was an engineering buddy of mine, and he turned to me and said, "Listen to that machine gun." And I said, "That isn't any machine gun." I said, "That sounds like that deck winch with the rolling over the cogs up on top." The next thing we knew, it hit right on top of us, and of course we knew then the battle was on. We'll make no mistake about it, it raised the deck up behind us. And I ran atop side just in time to see some of the boys falling in the band, which was playing colors. And at that time the battle station alarms went off, the bugle sounded general quarters, and we ran to our battle stations. Of course, some of the boys didn't make it because they blew up the bow, and the real battle was on top side. But we got the ship underway in 18 minutes flat, which was a record cold iron on a battleship. And at the time that we hit our battle stations, we sent out over 10,000 rounds of high-end aircraft ammunition towards the Japanese aircraft. When we got underway, we were blazing away at them at full power, but the bombers and torpedo planes come in up the channel and hit us in mid-channel, which we received 2 torpedoes and 8 bombs. And we were going down in 75 feet of water. The tugboats come along and pushed us over to the beach in order to keep the ship from sinking and blocking the channel. And during all of this battle, of course, they were hitting the other battleships at the same time. And consequently, one went down the stack of the Arizona, killing over 1,100 men in three seconds. Very few men lived to tell about that. There were other ships blowing up around. The Fort Island was on fire. All the battleships were burning. Boats were picking up the dead and wounded on the water. There was quite a big commotion on the ship, because out of the 5th and 6th Division, over 155 men lost their life on the Nevada. there was over 200 dead at the end of the battle, and approximately 400 wounded out of 1,100 men. During the attack, a lot of the men were wounded so severely they were burned from incendiary bombs, which we learned a lot about later. These bombs would, when the men would go in to put the fire out, would jump out and burn them until the flesh would fall off the bones. And in fact, they would think they would have a chance of living, maybe amputate a leg or two, and then the men would be dead, of course, in a few seconds, not knowing the total disaster of the men. And the doctor, when he got through with all the wounded, looked like he'd been skinning a bunch of jackrabbits. He was fuzzy and tired and worn out. And 2 or 3 men, Chief Boatswain Hill, played a heroic part on the Nevada. He got Congressional Medal of Honor. He chopped the lines, stayed up on the bow and chopped the 21-inch lines in two to get the ship underway. Got blowed off the ship 3 times and returned to get killed. And they all fought gallantly and held together pretty well, but even through the tough commotion and the severe beating and pounding we took.
Why don't you, can you tell us a little about what happened to the Nevada following this?
The Nevada was beached in 45 feet of water and settled there, and we were put on 50 caliber ammunition guns, and the men that couldn't handle machine guns were put on rifles in case the Japs did return, but they didn't return. Of course, that night 3 of our own planes come in and was shot down. I believe it was 2 out of the 3 was shot down mistakenly because the men were so shook up. But then they brought the Nevada up. She returned to active duty and fought in Sicily, knocking trains off railroad tracks, and then returned to the Pacific again once more and was hit by kamikazes at Okinawa, killing 16 men. Later, she was put, after the war ended, she was put to the test at Bikini Atoll. Then from there she returned to Honolulu on tow line, but as they pulled her out of Honolulu, returned to the States for salvage, she broke the cable and went down to the sea.
What happened to you in the days following Pearl Harbor?
Following Pearl, I left on the USS Tangier, which is a aviation seaplane tender, and I went to a group of islands to try to keep the Japanese from taking New Caledonia. We were transferred as an aircraft service unit to keep the planes moving out of New Caledonia, and I stayed there 18 months before returning to the States, and then I got a 30-day leave and went home to visit my family.
What seemed to be the attitude of the men who were involved, the other soldiers and the other sailors who were there at that time? The feeling, the feeling of unexpectedness. Could you give some idea of the feeling?
Yes, I believe the men really had a remorseful feeling, mostly because they never expected such a thing could happen. They talked about it, but they didn't ever expect anything like this would happen or could happen. They were so shook up by it that they were very nervous. At least I know that I was, and I'm sure they were too, because you could touch a guy, and if you wasn't careful, he'd liable to knock you right down. He's that nervous. In fact, after I left Pearl, I was on the Tangier, and we were hauling ammunition to try to save Wake Island. And I was laying on the deck, and the alarm bell in the engine room sounds like a general quarters bell, and it went off, and I jumped to my feet and run to the ladder to jump off the ship, because I just knew we'd had it again. And all the people was lined up for chow that morning already started laughing at me. I felt kind of silly about it, but that's how nervous that we wound up. We were nervous for 3 or 4 months, at least I was.
What about the people living there? How did they seem to react and take it at that time?
The general public was shocked that the U.S. Navy couldn't overcome such a battle, but they didn't realize our capabilities. One of the things that caused us to lose a battle, and one of the biggest things, that reason for losing a battle, was that the battleships had 10-second setting on their ammunition instead of 2-second. We had 2-second settings. We had knocked the planes out point blank as they flew in. But we had 10-second, which put the ammunition up approximately 10,000 feet. And they exploded beyond the aircraft. Therefore, they made it in to do the damage.
Could you tell us something about the battleship Oklahoma during this period?
The Oklahoma capsized, as everyone knows. She turned over with her mast facing down and the right side of her bottom sticking up. And of course, most of the men that were in there were sealed in, and most of them died with suffocation. But there was, I believe, that number was either 13 or 16 that was cut out the following morning. They kept tapping on the metal of the ship, and one of the ship fitters, I believe he was, off of the Fort Island, went out there, and they put life rafts out there, and he climbed over there and cut a hole and cut these men out. They carried him on their shoulders clear across the airfield.
Thank you very much. You want to put up? Could you give me your full name and your address, please?
Arthur L. Taylor, 913 Christine Drive, Midwest City, Oklahoma.
Where were you stationed at the time? What unit were you with in Pearl Harbor?
I was aboard the USS New Orleans, heavy cruiser, Cass 32.
Why don't you tell us something about what happened beginning, let's say beginning the early morning of the 7th, or a period prior to that, if you feel it has any significant effect on it as far as Pearl Harbor Day is concerned.
It does have a lot. I raided Liberty the weekend that the Japs bombed Pearl Harbor, but being broke, I stood by for an old boy for $5, and I've always regretted it. But anyway, on the morning of the 7th, I was up real early, and actually I'd had 2 or 3 cups of mud, but I went up topside with another cup of mud, and was drinking it, and I looked over there, and so there was torpedo planes, those Kates coming in on the battle wagons. Actually, I saw the bombs going off, the fish going off, but I thought it was a simulated attack. And man, oh man, was I blowing my lid. And I walked around there and looked at them, and all at once we were at alongside the finger piers on the hammerhead crane, and the Japs came back and was machine gunners, and all at once there alongside me there. Then I woke up to the fact that there's something wrong here, especially when I saw the big red ball on the plane. So GQ hadn't went off on our ship, especially at that time. But about that time, GQ did go off, and well, we had our guns trained in, Tompkins in, ready boxes locked, and canopies over the guns. So and the old man's on the beach. So actually, we didn't know what to do. In fact, the biggest percent of the crew was on the beach. But anyway, we finally broke out some fire axes there and knocked the ready box's lid open, got the guns trained out, Tompkins out, the canopies off, and started firing. Well, I don't know. There's a ship on the other side, the USS San Francisco, came over to help us, and if you ever had a mixed crew, they were from the turrets, from the turret crews over there, and we were 5-inch 25, so actually they was throwing ammunition one way, and we was trying to get them to put it in the fuse pots. So finally we did get the firing, and at that time I was a pointer trainer over there, and they switched us to local control due to the fact their rangefinders were off, and we saw a Jap Kate over there that just made a run on the wagon. So anyway, he says, let's get on it. And okay, we get on it, and he says, fire when ready. The gun captain yelled, and we fired, and I saw the top of a palm tree fall out. I I'm sure the plane didn't go down, but the palm tree did go down. But I'll tell you, after this attack was over, after things died down, me especially, I certainly had a sicky feeling. I just couldn't believe it. Couldn't believe this could happen to us. The wagons was either capsized, burning, or inactive. And you just couldn't believe that this could happen to our Navy, and as unprepared as we were for it. But I know during the attack there was a gasoline lighter alongside, and I kept saying, "Oh Lord, if they just don't hit that, we'll make it. We'll make it." And sure enough, they didn't hit it.
Could you tell me something about what happened following this as far as you were concerned?
Yes, I can. I was just a boot at the time, and they gathered up a bunch of us and sent us out to pick up survivors first, and then the people that had been killed later. But I want you to know this is one of the sickiest, nastiest jobs I believe I ever got into. The wagons had a lot of boys in the water as well as the other ships, and some of them was really wounded bad, some of them was in terrible shape. But I know we went along and picked up the guys that we figured were in the worst shape. But I never will forget, one guy was on the Arizona. He was a colored boy, and we went around on the other side of the Arizona 2 or 3 times there picking up survivors, and every time we'd go by, he'd say, "Hey boy," he says, "why don't you get me?" And I wasn't the coxswain, but I asked the coxswain several times, "Well, why don't we take him aboard?" He said, "No, we get too many." Well, the last trip around we made, he says, "Well," I asked him, I said, "We're going to take that boy aboard?" He says, "Yeah, I'll get him." So we went alongside the stern there, and I reached over to get him, and he was burnt so bad that his hands, the hide just come off in my hand. But anyway, we got him aboard, but I don't think he ever lived. We got him to IE over there at the hospital.
What happened the following days for you after the Pearl Harbor?
We were still picking up survivors. About 4 o'clock in the afternoon, they called all hands back aboard and got us ready to get underway. And after, I think, 2 days, we got underway down to Johnson, Samoa, and Christmas Islands.
Did you observe the battleship Oklahoma, or did you have any contact with it at all? See what happened to it?
I had been aboard the USS Oklahoma. I had quite a few friends out of my company, out of boot camps, that did go aboard her, and I was real interested in the Oklahoma. And naturally, after the attack, I went alongside the Oklahoma, but she was completely capsized, and I didn't see no survivors in any way, or could find no survivors of the men that I went through boot camp with. But the Oklahoma was capsized, and she lay capsized throughout the war, I believe.
Could you tell me your name and address, please?
My name is V.S. McKennan Jr. I live at 316 Northwest 28th Street, Oklahoma City.
Do you go by V.S. or do you go by a name?
Well, my first name is Veer, V-E-R-E. I use it. They call me Mac or anything else to take a notion.
Well, V.S., I'll call you V.S. What was your assignment at Pearl Harbor, and where were you stationed?
Well, I was stationed at Kaneohe Bay Naval Air Station, just across the island from Pearl Harbor. I was a radio operator with Patrol Wing 1, Fleet Air Wing 1 out of San Diego. And we operated a squadron of PBY Catalina flying boats out of Kaneohe Bay.
Why don't you relate from the Pearl Harbor incident, beginning where you think the story would begin as far as you personally are concerned, and tell us what happened?
Well, The story, as far as that particular weekend is concerned, for me would begin the day following when we received our duty assignment. I was assigned to a duty crew for the weekend of Saturday and Sunday, and we were normally required during our days of duty to fly a 3-plane patrol search area out of the island of Oahu. And the morning of December 7th, we took off from Kaneohe Bay at about 7 o'clock in the morning to fly our normal patrol sector. And of course, we knew nothing at all about the attack at all. I did get a radio message. I was a radio operator on the plane. I intercepted a radio message from our number 3 plane informing Pearl Harbor that they had sighted one of these small submarines outside the channel, and that they had dropped some smoke bombs, and that's when the destroyer Ward went over and I think dropped some depth charges and eventually sunk it. We knew at the time this message was received that an attack of some sort was beginning or starting, but the type of it we didn't know. Now, this message came into the plane, or was intercepted, about 7:30 in the morning. It was sent in code by the radio operator aboard the plane who actually sighted the submarine, and I had to relay the message from our plane to Pearl Harbor since they were not receiving his signal. Pearl Harbor decoded the message and then asked us to check and verify, which involved a considerable amount of time. And of course, before that could be completed, while the attack had started, and we started receiving reports from different places all over the island that they were under attack. We flew 15 hours that day. Shortly after the attack, we were given a patrol sector outside of Pearl Harbor to search to try to locate the Japanese aircraft carriers and or the planes. The other 2 planes in the group did sight some enemy aircraft, but we didn't in our plane at all.
Could you follow through with what happened following the Pearl Harbor incident itself, as far as you were personally concerned?
Well, when we returned from our search area, we flew around the island. We sighted Barber's Point, which of course was in flames. Hickam Field was in flames, and we could see the ships that were out in the channel that had been sunk and were in the process of burning. Our base, Kaneohe, when we reached it, the planes on the ramps and the hangars had all been damaged, and some of those were burning. We had about 15 planes moored out in the bay, and they had all been sunk by the machine guns of the Japanese. Then we landed, and of course we're preparing to take off in case these planes returned again. After Pearl Harbor, within a day or so after that, our squadron was transferred from Kaneohe Naval Air Station to Pearl Harbor, and we patrolled out of there until February of 1942, when we went to New Caledonia.
Could you comment on the feeling of you have some, I know, but on the general feeling of the people when this happened, which obviously was unexpected, or appeared to be? Could you comment on how people reacted to it generally?
Well, I could comment about the feelings of the men in the squadron. was more, to me, outrage and fear. We didn't really know immediately, of course, what had actually happened or the extent of it. I know that we had several air raid alarms that evening at the base. I do remember that after we landed and the imminent attack fears died down a little bit, we were all instructed to go to the mess halls where all of our white uniforms were dunked in a barrel of coffee. We put them on wet, and we were all coffee colored for about a week after that. Some of us were well, muddy, you could say, more than anything else, because when they had the air raids, we left the barracks and went out into the fields to hide.
Did you observe the battleship Oklahoma, or did you had no contact at all with it? You want to come up? Yeah. Could you give your name and your address, please?
Roy R. McPherson, 1315 Northwest 16th Street, Oklahoma City.
Roy, you were in Honolulu, I understand, at the time of the Pearl Harbor attack. Why don't you tell a little bit about it from the way you observed it or the way you experienced it?
I was on leave this weekend and stayed at the Army Navy YMCA that night. I got up the next morning, had breakfast, and started to a friend of mine just a few blocks from the Y when a bomb hit right in a couple hundred yards ahead of me in front of the governor's palace, and it started some cars on fire. Everyone was running in all directions, not realizing what was going on, and I went back to the YMCA, and they said the Japs was raiding Pearl Harbor, so I put on my clothes, my work clothes, and went out where I was working at Hickam Field at the time. I went out to my job to see if I could do anything, and they wouldn't let me in the post. Said that our work clothes were the same color as the Jap uniforms, and they wouldn't let me in the place. So we went back to town. There's so much confusion going on that the only thing I could do was find me a drink, and I found a bar, but about the time I got there, the MPs came and shut off the whiskey. So that's about all we could do. But that night they moved women and children in from Pearl Harbor in the YMCA, and I had to give up my room there. And the lights were all out, and they said the water might be contaminated, so I went out and got a 5-gallon water out of a well to bring in for drinking water. And we finally found out later that the water at the Y was an artesian well and couldn't have been contaminated. So all I can say, I spent one hell of a hectic night.
Could you tell, you were probably nearer civilians than any of the other three we have talked with. I wonder if you might give a little bit about the general civilian reaction.
Well, I don't know. They were mixed up and as lost as I was. I'll tell you, there was just one bunch of afraid people. Didn't know whether they landed on the island or was going to be attacked at any time, or just what was happening. But I'd say 50% of people just couldn't believe it. But they eventually did. That's about all I can say about it.
Did you observe the battleship Oklahoma at any time during or following?
I've seen it burning.
Why don't you tell us a little about that? You don't? All right. Sure. Okay. Well, all right. Well, sure.
My name is Charles McKeen. I spoke earlier on the recording. I did see when we came atop side, previous to the last attack, that the seaplane that came in full of holes and run up on the beach, and that this destroyer Shaw had blew this three-man sub clear out on Fort Island. And as I recall, this is a three-man sub that they brought back to the United States and used on display. I have an idea this is a historical sub now, located some museum somewhere in the United States. But I did see it blown out on the beach at the time. We have at the time we have a organization called the Pearl Harbor Survivors Association, which is strictly the military survivors of Pearl Harbor. This group that's speaking at present are strictly military survivors, and this was founded in 1958 in California by a group of military survivors. Survivors, and this was founded in 1958 in California by a group of military survivors. Later it was picked up in all states in the United States and has grown to a huge number at the present, having several chapters in many states. This chapter, we have not a chapter, but we have enough to have a chapter in the state of Oklahoma at the present, already enrolled. But we need to get on the ground floor and make it grow, which I'm sure we will, since it is strictly military survivors. I think it should be controlled by the state, and I think that the men will get on the ball and come along with it, which is really an honorable organization. Also, it has its yearly annual books that are presented at the annual meetings. It has its constitution and bylaws. It has its quarterly paper, put out quarterly a year on a slick copy. All of this is included with the normal dues, which is no more than VFW or the American Legion post dues. It is really a good organization. Speaking of Pearl Harbor, where the wounded were taken over on the beach, the amphitheater, which was used for all of the people on the beach to see the movie at night, was turned into a ground hospital because all the hospitals were full. And this was several acres in which you couldn't see nothing but bodies of men suffering, and so many that people couldn't get to died just because they couldn't get enough doctors to service the men. And there was acres of these bodies out here. I think this should be gone as to let it known how many people had died and were still dying at the time because they couldn't get doctors and so forth to service the people. It was a horrible sight to look at and see the men suffer. I had a wound on my thumb, which was primarily a superficial wound, but yet it was a painful wound. But I wrapped it up with a piece of cloth and forgot it. no one ever knew got hurt at the battle. Thank you.